All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started with Unit 13 notes on organ systems. We'll take a look at the vocabulary first. We have the integumentary system, melanin, and the pharynx. So the integumentary system, primarily we're going to be looking at the organ skin, but also too it includes hair and nails as well, and we'll talk about different functions within. Melanin is a very important pigment. It's found in the hair, skin, and irises of eyes in people, and that's what determines the variations in different colors that we see, whether it's red hair, blonde, black hair, whether it's darker skin tone, lighter skin tone. It's all a result of variations of that pigment melanin. The pharynx we'll see as well as part of the digestive tract. We'll spend some time talking about differences between the pharynx and larynx, but understand too that's kind of the common term we use at the throat. Next, we have the larynx, so be sure to understand the difference between the two. The larynx is often referred to as the voice box. That's where our vocal cords are, and that's what allows us to make those vocal intonations. The trachea, that's our windpipe too. Again, just using some analogs for you, the common names for each to make them more familiar to you. We'll spend some time in this unit talking about nicotine and alcohol, their effects on the body, and how they affect different organ systems. Arteries and veins, another important distinction, much like pharynx and larynx, they're close to one another, but they have a different function. And the key way to remember this is that arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. Not all, but a vast majority of arteries do that. And veins, on the other hand, they carry deoxygenated blood, blood that contains little to no oxygen, towards the heart to be pumped and circulated back towards the lungs. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll talk about alcohol, specifically ethanol. That's the type of alcohol that's consumable and how it affects your different organ systems. And also, too, we'll spend some time talking about sleep, and in particular, the REM cycle. That's an acronym for rapid eye movement. That's where a lot of our dreaming happens as well. We'll talk about some hypotheses as to why we dream and what are the functions of it. So, essentially, how this unit is going to lay out is we're going to look at these different systems, talk about some of their components or what those systems are made of, and then we'll spend some time talking about their function, like what they do for the human body in particular, and then finally we'll go into a few different topics relating to those. So in the case of the integumentary system, we'll discuss melanin and sort of the genetic sources behind it. But the integumentary system, it consists of skin and its appendages like hair and nails. So skin is actually the largest organ in the entire human body. It accounts for 15% of your total body weight. So if you do the math, it's pretty incredible to think about. And we have two primary layers that we're going to focus on in these notes. We're going to be talking about the epidermis and also the dermis as well. So the epidermis is the outer layer. You can find that over on the right-hand side too, and it's been labeled. And underneath is the dermis, and that's where a lot of the work really happens within the skin. That's where sweat glands are found. That's where hair follicles start to begin to grow. That's where blood flows through both in arteries and veins. And so that's really the business part of it. So some of the functions of skin in the integumentary system, and we'll walk through each of these. We have protection from bacteria and also from cuts and scrapes, prevention of water loss, and then finally regulating body temps and homeostasis. So it's important to understand that we need to be able to have protection from bacteria and cuts and scrapes as well. Your epidermis actually comes off relatively easily. You give off an enormous amount of skin cells over the course of even a single day, and that's actually what dust is composed of primarily. So about like average 90% of dust that you find in your home is actually dead skin cells, which is kind of gross, but it gives you an idea too of how much dead skin cells we actually give off. Also too with the prevention of water loss. So that layer, especially the epidermis and dermis, it allows us to be able to retain water. It allows us to be able to avoid in situations where it would be very indicative or very conducive to evaporation. We can keep that water in our cells. And also, too, when you talk about regulating body temps, that refers to the ability to sweat because once we exude sweat, the moving air surrounding it helps to cool off temperatures in the body and again keep that term homeostasis. That's where the body likes to function at a optimal level. And now specifically we'll talk about melanin. So as again, that's a skin pigment. It determines both skin color and hair color, and there's 4 different variations of melanin, kind of chemical cousins to one another that make up all the different traits that we see on our planet. And typically, higher amounts of melanin are found in human populations that are typically exposed to more sunlight historically. So, interesting to think about too, but melanin is adaptive because it serves as sort of a natural sunscreen. It allows us to protect our cells from harmful UV rays. So, when we think about geographic distributions of different ethnicities around the world, it makes sense historically. One thing that's interesting to point out too is people that we would describe as Inuit. It's interesting because we think about their natural skin tone in an area of relatively high or low sunlight, depending on the time of year, but also, too, what's interesting to think about is if you've ever been out ice fishing, let's say on Lake of the Woods, especially in the springtime, maybe you're just out on a bucket and it's really warm that time of year. By the end of the day, you'll end up with a really bad sunburn, and not only because the sun is shining out on that warm, let's say February day, but also too because of the reflection off of the snow. And that's why we find a lot of people in the Arctic North and Inuits that have a darker skin tone, a higher presence of melanin to be able to protect their skin from those harmful reflecting UV rays off of ice and snow. So interesting to think about. Next, we'll dive into the respiratory system. It can be comprised or divided into two main parts. And so we have the upper respiratory tract, and then we have the lower respiratory tract as well. So the upper consists of the nasal cavity, pharynx, and larynx, while the lower consists of the trachea, bronchi, and the lungs. And the respiratory system, as we learned in the previous unit, its primary function is to take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. Oxygen is critical for our cells to be able to function, to be able to perform the process of cellular respiration. That's where they break down different chemicals to be able to release energy and do the wonderful things that they do. And CO2 is a byproduct of that. It's a waste product. And so that's why we need to be able to get rid of CO2 so our blood transports that to our lungs. And when we exhale, it allows that CO2 to exit our bodies. Here what we have in the picture too is a very zoomed up version of what we call alveoli. And so those are the small, tiny little air sacs that exist on all throughout our lungs. And what they do is they increase the surface area of the lungs tremendously because that allows for a more efficient gaseous exchange. It allows for diffusion, as we learned in the previous unit as well, to be able to move from those alveoli into the bloodstream or vice versa. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about vaping. How it affects the respiratory system. So I'll walk through these bullet points, and this information comes from Harvard Medical School in 2019. You can click on the link to check that out too. The big points that I'm trying to make there are that vaping, whatever the product, it's going to have nicotine in it in some way, shape, or form. Even the ones that claim to be nicotine-free, they have been found to contain small amounts of nicotine. It's highly effective, especially to a developing brain as well, so people in their teenage years. Number 2 here, it talks about some substances in e-cigarette vapor have been linked to an increased risk of cancer as well, so cancer-causing agents, what we call carcinogens in chemistry or in biology. And then finally, to accidental exposure to liquid from e-cigarettes has caused acute nicotine poisoning in children and adults. So within those pods, like let's say a Juul pod for instance, there's an enormous amount of nicotine, and if that's punctured or spilt on the skin, that can actually move through your epidermis, dermis, and into your bloodstream, but can have a really significant effect on how your body is functioning too, because it can lead to nicotine poisoning if you have it in high amounts within your bloodstream. And next, we'll take a look at the circulatory system. Sometimes this is also called the cardiovascular system. When you think of cardio exercise, that's something intended to increase your heart rate, so that's a good way to remember cardio. We have 3 main parts within the circulatory system. We obviously have the heart, we have our blood, and then arteries and veins as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about those in detail. The circulatory system, it's really closely tied to the respiratory system. It serves as a way to be able to transport oxygen. So when our lungs take in oxygen, blood pumps through with that beat of the heart, and it picks up that oxygen along the way and allows for it to be transported to all the different cells within the extremities of our body. But not only does it pick up oxygen as those red blood cells travel by, it also, as I mentioned earlier, drops off that carbon dioxide, that waste product from our cells. So it's a pretty efficient mode of transportation. And you can see by the arrows the sort of flow chart that we have here. We have high and low pressure areas, and also too, as that heart is beating, it's able to move either blood away through the arteries or back towards the heart through the veins. And so the differences in coloration are trying to indicate the presence of oxygen within the blood, and that's sort of noted there as well. So our blood, it also plays a critical role, as we learned in the previous units, in our immune system as well. So think white blood cells, antibodies, thinking off fighting infections. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we have arteries and veins. That's the difference between those two. So hopefully that gives you a better idea about the circulatory system. Next, we'll take a look at blood in particular. So nothing to necessarily fill in on this chart, but something very interesting to think about too. If you're fortunate enough to know your blood type, this will give you an idea about how common or how rare it is in a typical population within the United States. Understand that these blood types can vary quite a bit with different ethnic groups or if you went to different parts of the world. So these distributions or percentages would be definitely skewed different directions. But again, a typical human population here in the United States, you can see that A positive is the most common blood type, with the most rare blood type being AB negative. And let's talk about these blood types and what they mean a little bit. Essentially, there are antigens, sugars really, that exist on the outside of your blood cells. And what these do is they allow your immune system to identify whether this blood belongs in your body or whether it's a foreign invader. That's how our immune system picks up on infections from bacteria or viruses. But what's also interesting too is depending on the makeup or the chemical composition of these different antigens, your body can take in blood from other people as they donate it. So if we take a look here at the chart, really on the vertical axis, the y-axis, it says if your blood type is, and then you can see there, you can receive blood from. So if you look, if you are AB positive up at the top, that means that you can receive blood from any given blood type. You are what is called the universal recipient. But what's also important to note too is that if you look over on the far right hand side, it also means that you can only give to other AB positive people. Like your blood doesn't have a lot of value. You can only really receive blood from anybody else. And on the flip side of that, if you look at O negative, that is what we term the universal donor. Someone that donates O negative blood, that can be placed inside of any patient or any recipient without any adverse or negative effects. So pretty interesting to think about. A common question that I have is, what if a blood transfusion goes wrong? What if someone receives the wrong blood type? Well, what happens is the antibodies that already exist in your immune system will cause that foreign blood, if it's the wrong blood type, to actually clump up, and it sort of sticks together, and it can block arteries and veins. It can prevent blood flow. In high amounts of the wrong blood transfusion, it can definitely be fatal. So a very dangerous thing. You have to be very sure of a blood type before you go through with transfusions or donations. Next, we'll take a look at the digestive system. It's actually very complex in terms of its overall parts. We're going to focus on the major parts of it though. So we're going to take a look at the esophagus, stomach, small intestines, and large intestines. The accessory organs are things like the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. And those are there to secrete different types of enzymes within the digestive tract to allow us to digest different material. But again, we'll focus on these main four. And so the primary function of the digestive system is to absorb one of two things. It's trying to absorb water and nutrients. And what do we mean by nutrients? Well, that could be minerals, vitamins, fats, amino acids. It's trying to break down those primary types of organic chemistry or organic molecules, those macromolecules that we learned about in Unit 3, and take those into smaller parts, into those monomers. So carbohydrates, lipids, all those things that we've discussed in chemistry. And each stage is trying to just break things down a little bit further, because the smaller we can break down those macromolecules into monomers, the more easily our body can take them in and use them to build our cells to be able to perform the functions it needs to. And what's also really interesting to think about, it's important to understand that there is an entire tube that runs the length of the human body, and it's home to millions and millions of bacterial cells that are collectively called a microbiome. So if you think all the way back to ecology when we discussed the biome, you yourself as a human body are a biome as well. You can see over on the right-hand side, the Scientific American, a publication I think from 2012, it says your inner ecosystem and your body bacteria outnumber your own cells 10 to 1. And the question they pose is, who's in control? It's pretty interesting to think about. So next up, we'll take a look at alcohol in particular. So material, it can be absorbed through the different parts of the digestive system directly into the bloodstream. And the psychoactive drug, alcohol, and specifically ethanol, serves as a good example. So when it's consumed through the stomach and the intestines, it's broken down by the liver. But what happens is if people start to consume too much alcohol, the liver can't keep up. It simply isn't able to maintain that processing speed. So what happens is rather than the liver being able to break down that alcohol continues to exist in the bloodstream. And because it's in the bloodstream, your heart is pumping, it's carrying that alcohol up into your brain. And that's what's causing the different parts of the brain to function differently under the influence of alcohol. And it's important to understand, too, that alcohol is poisonous. That's why we have the term alcohol poisoning. When someone is consuming too much alcohol at a rate at which it's just too fast, the liver can't keep up, that toxin, that poison continues to accumulate in the bloodstream. It can lead to unconsciousness. It can lead to severe vomiting, where people can actually suffocate on their own vomit, which is scary enough. It can lead to organ shutdown, organ failure, a whole mess of things. So it's really important to understand when every commercial they talk about all the time, consume in moderation, all those different things for adults of the age. It's just, I think that's really important for you to understand that it is a poison. Next up, we'll take a look at the nervous system. So again, this is review from last unit a little bit. We have the central nervous system. It consists of the brain and spinal cord. And also, too, we have the peripheral nervous system. And that's the nerves in the limbs, the hands, feet of the body as well. And it really has two primary roles within the nervous system. It needs to receive and transmit stimuli. So that's a term that we use for what our senses pick up on. That can be sound, taste, touch, smell. All those things are different types of stimuli. And our brain, needs to be able to receive those stimuli, to pick up on them, and then also to be able to transmit and interpret that stimuli. So to understand how to interpret color, what does a taste indicate to the brain? How does a smell tie to a memory? Those are the big parts of the nervous system. It's really a series of circuits that communicate with one another. And sleep. Sleep is a critical step to both brain maintenance and development. The hypothesis is that sleep and even dreams is a way for your brain to be able to essentially clean itself, for lack of a better term. If you think about the amount of stimuli that you receive each and every day, just all the different things that you experience as you look, and let's say if you notice that there's a robin outside your door or outside your window or something like that, like whether or not that actually becomes a memory is based in part, they think, on the idea of sleep. There's information that we receive throughout the day that's not important and our brain needs to be able to get rid of because it doesn't have any relevance. We don't learn anything from it. It's just a happenstance of life. And there's also two critical experiences that sleep is thought to be able to store in long-term memory so we can reference back to it, and hence the part of why sleep is so important for learning as well. And then finally, too, it sort of lays out the different stages of sleep. What's really interesting, you probably already know this or maybe you're familiar with it. We've discussed it in class, but there are stages within sleep that include rapid eye movement. If you're a dog owner, too, I'm sure you've seen this when your dog's napping on the couch. That's where our brain is very active. That's where the point at which we're dreaming. They call it rapid eye movement because your eyes are actually moving quite a bit underneath your eyelids. We're not sure why that exactly is, but you can see the different physiological effects that go through with sleep. So really interesting to think about overall sleep and dreams. And really that's the end of our Unit 13 notes on organ systems. Hopefully you feel a little bit more familiar with our different types, the functions of which make up our entire human body, and some of the interesting facts behind them and how some chemicals can affect them negatively as well. So thanks so much for watching.